Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Curiosity During Quarantine, KDK, which is our new avatar of the program we have been hosting with the planetarium, Copy with Curiosity. So while during this period of the lockdown, we will be having this online avatar. Perhaps some of you have been here for some of our events earlier. It's jointly organized by ICTS, the new center of TIFR, and the Jawaharlal Nehru Planetarium in Bangalore City. So I am very thankful to Professor Shobhana Narasimhan for agreeing to give this talk for a general audience.
Good evening, everyone. Today I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Shobhana Narasimhan. Professor Shobhana Narasimhan is a professor of theoretical science at JNCASR in Bangalore. Her main area of interest is computational nanoscience. She did her PhD at Harvard University, postdoc in USA and Germany, and since 1996, she has been at JNCASR as a faculty. She is a recipient of many awards and recognitions for her scientific work. Sri Shakti Samman Science Award in 2010, Kalpana Chawla Woman Scientist Award of Government of Karnataka in 2010. She is also a fellow of National Academy of Sciences, India, and she is the international honorary member to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Narasimhan has a strong interest in innovative teaching methods and has organized and participated in many interactive workshops in several countries. She is also keen on promoting women in science causes. She is a member of the Standing Committee on Women in Science of the Government of India. I am extremely glad that she has agreed to give this KDK talk today. She'll be talking of agents of change, the role of catalysts in our modern world. And if you have any questions and comments during the talk, please put it in the chat box and I will ask Shobhana to take over from here.
Thank you, Professor Gopakumar, Professor Dey, and Dr. Madhusudan. I hope you can see my screen and hear me clearly. It's a great pleasure for me to give this talk. I think it's very important for us scientists to share what we're doing with the general public and also with young students. So today I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about my scientific interests. So I'm talking about agents of change, the role of catalysts in the modern world. So I've divided my talk into 4 or 5 parts. So let me start by telling you a little bit about the early days of catalysis and what is a catalyst. So let me start by asking you what you think might be the most important discovery of the 20th century. So of course, this is not a clear answer for this question. Maybe you think it was the discovery of penicillin because of antibiotics. Maybe you think it was the discovery of the car. This picture here is of an early computer, the first computer. Maybe you think it was airplanes. Maybe you think it was the TV. Maybe you think it was the internet. So of course, different people have different opinions, but you might be surprised what many scientists think is the most important discovery. And this is the Haber-Bosch process. And many people feel this is the most important discovery of the 20th century. So what I've put up here is an article from the scientific journal Nature. It was a Millennium essay, which was published in 1999. And here the author has said, of all the century's technological marvels, the Haber-Bosch process has made the most difference to our survival. So let me read out for you the first paragraph from this article. He says, what is the most important invention of the 20th century? Aeroplanes, nuclear energy, space flight, television, and computers would be the most common answers. Yet none of these can match the synthesis of ammonia from its elements. The world might be better off without Microsoft and CNN, and neither nuclear reactors nor space shuttles are critical to human well-being. But the world's population could not have grown to today's 6 billion. It was 6 billion then, it's 7 billion now, without the Haber-Bosch process. So what is this Haber-Bosch process? Many of you would have studied it in school, but if you haven't, I'll just remind you. It is a way of converting nitrogen from the air and hydrogen into ammonia. So this animation is showing you what the Haber-Bosch process does. These pink molecules are nitrogen, the green are hydrogen. So let's see what happens. They come down, they sit on an iron catalyst, and then they recombine, the bonds are broken, you see them breaking, they form ammonia, and then the ammonia goes away. Okay, so why is this so important? So again, as you might have learned in school, and you might remember, plants need specific forms of nitrogen to grow. So you have to supply this nitrogen somehow. So in the early days, people knew that they needed this nitrogen, but they didn't know how to supply it. So they used to get it from organic sources like decaying vegetable matter, or they used to use ground up bones. Okay, maybe animal bones, but they also used to use human bones. So there was this rather gruesome thing that used to happen. People used to go to battlefields where lots of people had died, and they would take the corpses and they would use the bones of those corpses as fertilizer. Okay, but that was clearly not a very nice thing to do, and it's also not a sustainable source. So people knew that they had to find a way of synthesizing these sources chemically. And after the development of this Haber-Bosch process, ammonia-based compounds started being used widely as a fertilizer, and they were also used as explosives. It was in the news recently. Many of you will remember this because, for example, in early August, there was many tons of ammonium nitrate that was stored in a warehouse in Beirut, and it was not stored very safely, and it exploded on August 4, 2020. You see a picture of this explosion in this picture, and that explosion destroyed most of the city of Beirut. Okay, hundreds of people died and thousands of people were injured, and even more lost their homes. So why do people say it was so important for our lives? I think that it was the development of this Haber-Bosch process that is responsible largely for the explosive growth in the world population. Okay, so the world's population was always growing, except for some dips due to, plagues like the Black Death, etc. But after the Haber-Bosch process was discovered, because people could synthesize chemical fertilizers, they could grow a lot more food, and then we were able to support a much greater population. So this graph shows the world population, how it has grown, the blue graph, and the red graph is estimating how much this population would have grown if there was no Haber-Bosch process, if there were no chemical fertilizers. That is how much of the population we would have been able to feed. Okay, so clearly this process has made a huge difference. And in fact, it's estimated that in our bodies we have nitrogen in various forms, amino acids, etc. Half of that nitrogen in our bodies actually comes from the Haber-Bosch process. So it's estimated that half of the nitrogen in our bodies comes from the Haber-Bosch process. Also, the tree rings, if you take a cross section of a tree trunk, you can see by the width of the tree ring how much the tree grew in that year. And it is said that if you take a cross section of a very old tree trunk, you can see that as soon as the Haber-Bosch process was developed, the trees started growing much faster. So you can see what a difference this process made to life on Earth. So this Haber-Bosch process really changed the world. And in Germany, they started celebrating this process, saying they advertise it as Brot aus Luft. That means bread from the air, because the nitrogen was taken from the air and then it was used to grow wheat, which they turned into bread. And it was so important for Germany because it kept Germany supplied with fertilizers and also explosives during the First World War. And people estimate that if it weren't for this process, the First World War would have ended 2 years earlier. But Fritz Haber, he was the scientist who developed this process. He was kind of controversial because he not only worked on this process, but he also worked on developing poison gases. Okay, they used poison gases during the First World War. Both sides used them, but the Germans, I believe, used it first. And the soldiers would be gassed, mostly by chlorine. And many people found it very controversial that this is what he worked on. So this picture on the left, the guy whom you see, pointing his finger like that, that is Fritz Haber. He's supervising the use of poison gases in the First World War. And this story has a rather sad ending because his wife, whom you see in this other picture on the right, that's Clara Immerwahr, she was also a chemist. And she really disapproved of the fact that he was doing this kind of work. And so when he came back from the first deployment of poison gases in the war, they had a big fight. And that night she committed suicide. So it's a very sad story. And incidentally, the institute in Berlin, which he worked in, it was then called the Kaiser's Wilhelms Institute. And now it's called the Fritz Haber Institute after him. And that's where I worked in Germany as a postdoc. And you can see, the house where they lived is now where they hold their seminars. And you can see the piano where Clara Immerwahr used to play the piano, etc. So after the war, the first Nobel Prize that was given in 1918 to Fritz Haber. And that was again very controversial because people said, okay, he'd done this great advance. He had found this Haber-Bosch process, which benefited humanity. But other people thought he was a war criminal because he had developed poison gases. So some people felt he shouldn't be given the Nobel Prize for that. But he was given the Nobel Prize for the synthesis of ammonia from its elements. That is his Nobel Prize diploma over there. And it's interesting because people didn't necessarily predict that he would end up as a Nobel Prize winner. In fact, his PhD defense, the examiners thought in parts he was very brilliant, but he was also very ignorant about certain things. And so he barely passed his PhD exam. It's also interesting how he ended up as an academic, okay? So after his studies, he went to work for his father, who used to sell chemicals. And there was an epidemic of cholera. And in those days, when there was cholera, people would spread a lot of bleach, which is the chemical sodium hypochlorite. And Fritz told his father, I think there'll be a huge demand for bleach. So you buy up all the stocks of bleach you can because we'll be able to sell a lot of it. And in the end, there wasn't this big demand and his father wasn't able to sell it. And he had all this bleach on his hands, which he didn't know what to do with. So he got very irritated with Fritz and said, you have no head for business. You won't be any good at business. You will only be good in academia. So you go and try to become a professor. Okay. And Carl Bosch, the other person whom this prize is named after, the process is named after, he worked for a company and he's the one who found out how to make this process work on an industrial scale because it needed very high pressures and temperatures. And he was also given the Nobel Prize in Chemistry much later, 1931. You might know the name Bosch because it's a company that makes refrigerators, washing machines, etc. That is not this Bosch, but it was his uncle. Okay. So now finally, let me tell you what is a catalyst. This is a word that started in science, but is used now also in our daily lives. A catalyst is a person or thing that causes an event or change. So for example, we say the coronavirus pandemic is a catalyst that may change world order. A person might be a catalyst. In fact, when I put up the notice for this talk on Facebook yesterday, so here's the notice I put up. Some of my friends saw this and they saw the title, Agents of Change, the Role of Catalysts in the Modern World. And you see the comments down here. One of my friends said, oh, she thought the talk title meant I was the agent of change. And then another friend said, oh, I thought it meant you were the catalyst. Shobana Narasimhan is the catalyst. So we use this word catalyst a lot. But of course, this talk is about the scientific catalyst. So what is that? In science, you probably have all studied it in chemistry, but I'll remind you anyway. A catalyst is a substance that increases the rate of a chemical reaction, but is itself left unchanged at the end of the reaction. So let me tell you a little bit about the history of catalysis and what we know about how catalysts work. So it has a really long history, okay? So it goes back to the Dark Ages. So the Dark Ages in Europe, they call the time between the 5th and 10th century AD the Dark Ages, because they thought that was not a time of great intellectual development in Europe. But in other parts of the world, in fact, remarkable developments were happening, in particular in the Middle East. In the Islamic countries, there were very important advances in science during this time, also in India. And so there is this person called Abu Musa Jabir bin Hayyan. Not too much is known about his life. In fact, some people say he's a mythical figure who didn't really exist. But as far as we know, he lived in the 8th century, and he's known as the father of chemistry. And he wrote a book called Kitab al-Kimya, that means Book of Chemistry. And as far as we know, he was the first person to perform a catalyzed reaction. He also did very other important first things in chemistry. He described sublimation, crystallization. He discovered aqua regia, hydrochloric acid, acetic acid, citric acid. And he also has had a big influence on our vocabulary, certainly in chemistry. For example, he introduced the word alkali, which we still use. There is also this word gibberish, which you may know. It's in English, gibberish means words that have no meaning, nonsense words. And it is believed that this word gibberish is derived from his name, Jabir. Okay, because his writings were supposed to be so difficult to understand that some people thought they were nonsense, and it gave rise to the word gibberish. Okay, but that was in the 8th century, and it took 1,000 years more before people began to understand what is catalysis. So 1,000 years later, there was this Swedish scientist, Berzelius, and he invented the word catalysis. He also invented other words that we use in chemistry, like allotrope and isomer. So this is his definition of catalysis or catalyst. It's very wordy, so I won't go through the whole definition, but basically it is the same definition that I gave you a few slides before. But he defined what a catalyst is, but people still did not understand how catalysts work. What do they actually do? It's clear that if you have a catalyst present, a reaction happens, or maybe it happens faster, but they didn't understand why do they work. Okay, so, but people started using catalysts long before they started understanding how they work. So this is a picture of Ostwald, whom you might have also learned about in chemistry. There's this Ostwald process. And he was the first to get a Nobel Prize for catalysis. He got the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1909. Incidentally, 1909 is also the year in which Haber discovered the Haber process. And this is from his Nobel lecture, which was titled On Catalysis. He said a remarkable thing here is that certain of these phenomena have been known ever since the close of the 18th century and developed into large-scale industries, it being quite typical of technology not to wait at all until science has tidied up a thing theoretically before applying it. Okay, so companies started using catalysis immediately. So how did they find out? How did they find out that if you put this iron catalyst, this Haber process will occur? The remarkable thing is, it was just, they tried thousands of things and then they found out it happens. So how did they choose iron? Actually, Haber did not use iron. He found out that if you use an element called osmium, that is when the reaction happens. And then in this company called BASF, another person called Mitaj tested about 2,500 materials. And then they decided that iron was the best catalyst to use at the industrial level. Osmium was actually a better catalyst, but at that time, there was very, very little osmium available in the whole world. The entire world supply of osmium was only 80 kilos. So it's not practical to use it. But iron is, of course, very widely available, and that's why they decided to use iron. So let me now tell you, what does a catalyst do? So in a chemical reaction, here I've shown you an atomic scale view of what a chemical reaction looks like. Okay, these red atoms are chlorine atoms. There's a chlorine molecule which comes to a benzene molecule and they react. Let me show you again. Here's the chlorine molecule coming. The bond between the chlorine atoms breaks here, and then new bonds are formed. One chlorine atom forms a bond with the benzene, another bond is broken here, and then a hydrogen and chlorine form a bond to form hydrogen chloride. So bonds break and new bonds are made. That's very important for a chemical reaction to occur. To break a bond, you have to supply energy to the molecule. Okay, so here is a graph. On this axis is energy, on the y-axis is energy, and this is showing, on the x-axis is showing as the reaction progresses. The reaction in this case is just the bond breaking. You have to stretch the molecule till the bond breaks. And to stretch it, you have to supply energy. Okay, so this energy I have shown here by this blue arrow. It is called the activation energy. That is the energy you have to supply to break the bond in this case. Now, the higher this energy mountain is, the more difficult the reaction is, the less likely it is to occur. Now, there's a slight subtlety here. We don't actually climb the peak of the mountain, but what is called a saddle point. So let me show that to you here. This is a picture of actually Cape Town in South Africa. So let's say you have a pirate over here. This is Captain Jack Sparrow from Pirates of the Caribbean. Okay, he's by the seaside and there is some treasure waiting for him over here. And he wants to go grab the treasure. To do that, he has to climb over this mountain. How is he going to go? Now, he could climb over the mountain by climbing over the mountain peak. But that would be a rather stupid thing to do unless for some reason he's a fanatical mountain climber, right? It's going to take him a lot of effort to climb up the mountain. So that's not how he's going to go. He's a smart pirate, which we all know Captain Jack Sparrow is. He would instead take this path. Now, if you look at this path, you will see he's climbed not over the peak of the mountain, but over what is called a saddle point. Okay, a saddle point is something that curves like this in one direction, but is curving like that in another direction. So that is exactly what molecules do in a chemical reaction. They climb over the saddle point. So this is showing a molecule climbing over the saddle point. And what you want to know is, can you reduce the height of this barrier, the height of this saddle point, to make the reaction happen more easily? So if you have this and you can instead make it like this, then obviously your reaction is going to happen more easily, it's going to happen faster, it's more likely to occur. So this is the most important thing that catalysts do. They reduce the height of this barrier. Okay, so this is a way of flattening the curve. Okay, this is an expression you hear a lot nowadays in the context of coronavirus. This is also a way of flattening the curve, though in a different context to how people use it in coronavirus. So how do you flatten the curve? Okay, so this is just a joke animation. I saw that it shows a scientist, standing and working hard in the beginning, and then eventually he flattens the curve by just lying down in bed. So how do catalysts flatten the curve? Okay, so what the catalyst does is it makes it easier to break the bonds and make the new bonds for the chemical reaction to happen. So let me show you a movie for the Haber process. Again, this is a movie of the Haber process. Okay, so watch carefully. You see a nitrogen molecule coming down. It is sitting on the catalyst surface and the bond has broken. So you have two nitrogen atoms. Hydrogens are coming down. Those bonds are breaking. Okay, and now new bonds are made between nitrogens and hydrogens. First one hydrogen is attached, then another hydrogen is attached. Now a third hydrogen is attached, and now the ammonia flies away. Okay, so this was something that is very hard to happen if the molecules are just floating around in air. This breaking of the bond and the making of the new bonds is much easier because these nitrogens and hydrogens are sitting on the iron. The iron is this gray surface over here. So why is that easier on the iron? Okay, why does the catalyst make it easier for this reaction to happen? Okay, so let me try to sort of justify it for you. The bonds, say, between the nitrogen, the intramolecular bonds, they become weaker when they sit on the catalyst surface. This is because when atoms have more neighbors, they tend to sit further apart, and then it is easier to break the bonds. So I've tried to make an analogy here. Like nowadays, say if you are in a crowd, okay, then you want to have social distancing, so you sit far apart. But if you're at home with just your partner, then you can sit close together and you have a tight bond between you. Or another way of looking at it is, if you're a person who has lots and lots and lots of friends, then maybe you're not so close to any of those friends, and maybe those friendships can also break. But if you have just one best friend, then you're really, really, really close to that friend, and it is very hard to break that friendship. So it is the same way for a molecule. The molecule goes and sits on the catalyst surface, and it has lots of neighboring atoms. So it is easy to break the bonds. Whereas when the gas phase, when it is floating around, it has just one or two neighbors, and it's very difficult to break the bonds. Okay, so now I have shown you the steps in the synthesis of ammonia. This is another picture showing the sequence. This is the nitrogen and hydrogen coming down. The hydrogen bonds have broken. Now the nitrogen has sat, then the nitrogen bond is breaking, etc. So how do we know how much energy each of these steps costs, etc.? This was discovered, about 80 years after Haber and Bosch first came up with this process. The person who led to most of this scientific understanding is Gerhard Ertl. He was a scientist at the Fritz Haber Institute, which is the place where I told you Fritz Haber worked and I also worked. And in fact, Professor Ertl was a professor when I was there, and many of my close friends were his students. And he got the Nobel Prize in 2007 for much of the understanding that he gave us about how catalysts work at the atomistic level, including his the understanding he gave us of how this Haber process works. And one of the things that he taught us, which is very important, is that this step, which I have circled in pink, where the bond between two nitrogen breaks, is what is called the rate limiting step. That is, for each of these steps, you have to climb a mountain, and the mountain is highest for this step. So this step is the bottleneck. What do I mean by that? Now here is an animation. I'm sure you have all faced this. This is looking at a traffic moving along a road from above. And you see that suddenly the road has narrowed from 4 lanes to 3 lanes. Maybe because they've closed the road, maybe there's an accident, maybe there's a bridge. And because the number of lanes has suddenly decreased, the traffic slows down. There's a bottleneck. But that bottleneck slows down all the traffic everywhere. So it's the same way for a chemical reaction. If one step is very slow, that is the rate limiting step. It slows down the whole reaction. So if you want to make the reaction go faster, maybe that is the step you should focus on to try to make that step go faster. Also, when the molecules try to jump over this hill, they have to try many, many times to jump over. So every attempted jump need not be successful. So here, instead of making an analogy to climbing a mountain, I'm making an analogy to a high jumper, okay? Every attempted jump need not be successful. Here you see this video of this poor guy. He's trying again and again and again to jump over, and he's failing repeatedly. But as you would have seen if you're watching the Olympics or something, very often they fail a few times and they finally succeed. So it's the same way for molecules in a reaction. So watch carefully here. It's trying, it's trying, it's trying, it's trying, and finally it succeeds. So here the reaction is carbon monoxide coming down on a surf catalyst that's covered with oxygen, and it is picking up one more oxygen and forming carbon dioxide and going away. Okay, so this is a very important reaction, which I will talk about more in just a while. Okay, so carbon monoxide being converted to carbon dioxide on an oxygen covered catalyst surface. So as you see, it has to try several times before the reaction actually happens. So now let me tell you a little bit about where and how catalysts are used today. So our lives really depend on catalysis in many ways. So you probably haven't stopped to think about it, but without catalysis, our lives would be completely different. So it is estimated the worldwide use of catalysts is about $35 billion per year, and 90% of chemical manufacturing processes involve catalysts. Now, 1% of the whole world's energy consumption is used for the Haber-Bosch process. That's a lot, 1%, okay? I mean, that's a huge amount. Now, also in our bodies, catalytic processes are going on all the time. In our bodies, the catalysts that are there, the biological catalysts, are what are called enzymes. I'm sure you've heard of enzymes. So these are proteins that act as biological catalysts, and they perform functions like cutting the bonds in molecules, rearranging the atoms in a molecule, which is called isomerization, etc. Here, I've shown you an animation of just one such process. There are many such processes that happen in our bodies. So the purple blob here is a visualization of a catalyst in our body, an enzyme called sucrase. And what sucrase does is, if we have eaten what is called table sugar, which is sucrose, sucrose to be metabolized in our body has to be converted to other forms. So the sucrose comes and is absorbed on this catalyst. And then when it is on this catalyst, okay, so let's just wait a bit. You see now the sucrose is coming, fitting into the catalyst. A water molecule comes, it does what is called hydrolysis, and it cuts the sucrose into two other monosaccharides, it's called, two other sugars, which are fructose and glucose. Okay, so this is an example of a catalytic process that is happening in our bodies. Now, we also need catalysts to protect the environment. For example, if you look at vehicle exhaust, okay, this is a familiar sight on Bangalore roads, and for example, you see that there's all this exhaust coming out of cars and autos and stuff. And this exhaust contains many bad things. It contains carbon monoxide, which, as you may well know, is poisonous. It contains hydrocarbons. It contains nitrogen oxides, which cause smog, acid rain, ozone layer depletion, etc. So we can't just let this exhaust go. We have to do things to these gases before they can be emitted. Okay, so cars nowadays contain what's called a catalytic converter. Okay, so in this catalytic converter, there's a layer of ceramic which is covered with little catalyst particles. So these catalysts are palladium, platinum, and rhodium. It contains really tiny amounts of this, maybe 5 to 6 grams in one catalytic converter. But these are really expensive metals, okay? They're precious metals. Now, the price of these metals fluctuates widely, okay? But both palladium and rhodium this week were more expensive than gold. Okay, I put the prices there. You see, palladium and rhodium cost more than 5,000 rupees for just 1 gram. Gold was about 4,600 rupees. Platinum currently is cheaper than gold, but very often, I mean, as I said, its price fluctuates a lot. Very often, platinum is much more expensive than gold. So a catalytic converter, even though it has such tiny amounts of these metals, it really contains a lot in terms of monetary value of these metals. So much so that there is this whole crime wave of catalytic converters being stolen. And so you see a lot in the newspapers that there are thieves who come and steal the catalytic converters from your cars because they can sell it and people recover these precious metals. And so the catalytic converter is worth, you know, a lot of money. And now there's also people selling, I haven't seen them being sold in India, but if you look on the web, you see people are selling now special locks so that you can fix the you can lock the catalytic converter, which is under the car, so that it makes it hard for thieves to come and steal the catalytic converter. Okay, so it's called cat lock, cat clamp, etc. Okay, so what happens in a catalytic converter? So there are reduction reactions and there are oxidation reactions. So the reduction is the nitrogen oxides are reduced to nitrogen, And the oxidation is carbon monoxide is oxidized to carbon dioxide, and so are the hydrocarbons. Of course, it's good because carbon monoxide is really poisonous, so you want to oxidize it to carbon dioxide. But carbon dioxide, wait a minute, you might have heard, is carbon dioxide good? Well, it's a greenhouse gas, so that's still not very good. It's bad, but it still won't kill you immediately. So carbon dioxide is better than carbon monoxide, though it's not so great. Okay. Now, another interesting thing about these catalytic converters is that when the exhaust gases are emitted, little tiny little bits of these precious metals which are in the catalytic converter also come out with the gases. So if you look at the dust just near a highway where cars are emitting exhaust, you find tiny little bits of platinum, palladium, rhodium in this dust by the roadside. So there are lots of scientific papers about this. For example, here I have said, put up a paper which looked at the dust in Hyderabad and analyzed it for platinum, palladium, rhodium. Below, I've shown two people who were sweeping up the roadside dust. This is a video which you can see on the web. I would recommend you go do it. So what they did was they actually swept up the dust and they analyzed it to see how much of these precious metals were there. So they found that if you take 1 ton of fine sifted roadside dust, then it contains 6.7 grams of platinum. Now you might think, oh, who's going to bother 1 ton for 6.7 grams of platinum? But 6.7 grams of platinum is still worth about 35,000 rupees. So maybe it's worth the effort. Of course, I should tell you this experiment was done in America. And I suspect that in India, our dust has far more non-valuable dust because we have a lot of dust from other sources also. So the ratio of unvaluable dust to precious metals might be a little bit more unfavorable here, but it's still an interesting bit of information, I think. So now I want to tell you a little bit about what is the research that is being done today. So we want now to design better catalysts. Okay, so what is a better catalyst? In what way is it better? It might be a faster catalyst in that the reaction happens faster. Faster could mean, by that I mean it could happen at a lower temperature. It could happen at a lower pressure. Because, for example, for the Haber process to happen, the way it's done industrially right now, you need very high temperatures, very high pressures. It could mean you want it to be cheaper because, for example, these catalytic converters, I told you they use very expensive metals. It could be that the reaction is more selective because the reaction may not produce just what you want. It might produce lots of other things which you don't want. It could be more stable, like all these catalysts degrade over time, they decompose. Okay, so you might want to improve one or more of these things. So let's talk about cheaper. How can you make a catalyst cheaper? There are two ways that you could think of making it cheaper. You could make it of less costly materials, or another obvious way that people are thinking about this way is let's make the catalyst really, really small. Okay, like let's use smaller quantities of expensive materials. So this is where nanotechnology comes in. I'm sure you've all heard of nanotechnology. Nanotechnology means making things really, really small. So can we make nano catalysts? Okay, so this is a really active area of research. So in fact, this is something people are doing. Since about 2007, the catalytic converters in cars, the catalytic particles, I mean, the particles were always very small, but now they're actually nanocatalysts. They're actually of nanometer sizes. Okay, so what is a nanometer? In case you don't know, it is 1/10⁹. So how small is that? If you take a human hair, which is something we all think of as very small, and you divide up the width of the human hair into 1 lakh pieces, that is how small a nanometer is. So nanocatalysts are obviously very good because they're really small. So you need a very, very little bit of a precious metal. But it's not just that you need very little. They're actually better catalysts. Okay? So this is the surprising thing that people didn't realize, that they're actually better catalysts. So this is a graph I just took from one paper. There are many other papers. This is the same reaction that I was talking about that happens in catalytic converters, where carbon monoxide is oxidized to carbon dioxide over a platinum catalyst. And they have looked at the size of the nanoparticle. Like say the nanocatalyst is 4 nanometers, the platinum catalyst is 4 nanometers, you reduce it to 3 nanometers. This is on the y-axis, it's how much carbon dioxide you get, how fast is the carbon monoxide oxidized to carbon dioxide. You see, it's better to have 3 nanometers than 4 nanometers. If you can make it 2 nanometers, it's even better. But if you go down to 1 nanometer, it gets a little worse. Okay, so there are interesting size effects happening. Okay, now let's think a little bit about gold. I told you that many of these materials, palladium, rhodium, they're actually more expensive than gold. So you might start thinking, okay, so if they're actually more expensive than gold, can we use gold instead? So initially, it seems like a really dumb idea. Why is that? That is because gold is, as you may know, it's the most noble of all metals. That is, if you have gold that is of large sizes, like gold that you have in a gold coin or gold that you have in jewelry, it's really unfriendly. That is, for example, unlike silver, it does not get oxidized. It is very inert. It's very unreactive. This is partly why we value it for jewelry. Okay, so other atoms or molecules can't come on these big pieces of gold and form bonds and break bonds and things like that. But there is a surprise. Gold has some surprises for us at the nanoscale. Okay, at the big scale, it might be telling other atoms and molecules go away, but at the small scale, it's saying, come here, let's party. So nano-sized gold becomes really friendly. And it was discovered in 1987 that gold nanoparticles can be good catalysts. They can be good catalysts for lots of reactions, including the oxidation of carbon monoxide to carbon dioxide. So since then, there's been a lot of work on gold nanocatalysts. And in fact, that's one of the important fields of research. In my research group, we work on gold nanocatalysts. And when you go down to really, really small sizes, where you just have a few atoms in the nanoparticle, and the important thing is that now in experiments, they can control it so precisely, okay? They can make a nanoparticle with just 2 atoms or 3 atoms or 4 atoms or 5 atoms, and they can control it. Then they find that it really matters for the catalytic activity exactly how many atoms you have. Adding or removing 1 atom to a nanoparticle can make a big difference to its catalytic activity. Okay, so here, for example, this are taken from a paper where they've looked at the catalytic activity of very small gold nanoparticles for carbon monoxide oxidation. And if you look here, you see that 8 atoms in the nanoparticle, it's a pretty good catalyst. If you take away 1, if you have 7 atoms in the nanoparticle, it's not a good catalyst at all. But 8 is good. And 9 atoms, again, it's not so good. So it's really interesting here what's happening. And what is the ultimate that you can do? The ultimate you can do is you have just 1 atom as the catalyst. And this is a really exciting field right now, and people are finding that just one atom can be a good catalyst for many reactions. For example, here, this is a piece of news about how you can use single platinum atoms as a catalyst to get hydrogen from methanol. Now, hydrogen is something people want to use as a fuel for cars, for example, but storing hydrogen gas is really difficult and it's dangerous because hydrogen explodes, etc. So the idea is that instead you store methanol and then you carry out this reaction and it generates hydrogen, which then you can use as a fuel. So now, how do we design? These are again just trying out different things. So how do we actually design a better catalyst? Now it's been estimated, I told you that Mitash used to tested about 2,500 catalysts for the Haber-Bosch process. By now, people have tested about 250,000 catalysts. But is that really the best you can do? Just try. Is trial and error really the best we can do? What we want to do now is, instead of doing this trial and error or brute force method, we want to do what is called rational design of catalysts. For this, you need to go back and forth between theory and experiment. So I am a theoretician. So what is the role of theorists in all this? So let's go back to this guy I told you about, Jabir, the Arab scientist in the Middle Ages. He said the first essential in chemistry is that you should perform practical work and conduct experiments. For he who performs not practical work nor makes experiments will never attain the least degree of mastery. Now, so he's saying you really have to do experiments. Now, I found this very funny when I read this because I have a secret, okay? I'm giving you today a talk about chemistry, but I actually did not study chemistry formally after the 12th standard. I dropped chemistry, okay? I have my BSc, my MSc, my PhD in physics, but I didn't study any chemistry. Why didn't I study chemistry? I liked chemistry as a subject, but I was just hopeless at these chemistry practicals. You know, in the practicals, they give you some compound and say, do experiments to analyze what this compound is. I would follow the procedure so carefully and I could never find out what the compound was. I never got it right. So I said, okay, I can't do these practicals. I'm going to drop chemistry. So everybody else who majored in physics in Bombay University for their BSc, they did physics, maths, chemistry. I got special permission and I was the only person in the whole university who instead did physics, maths, geology. Okay, so I realize experiments are important, but I'm really not very good at them. Okay, so I am one of those people who look at what atoms and molecules do, but I do it on the computer. And this is something very important to really understand how catalysts work. So to do this, we need to use quantum mechanics. Okay, so you perform quantum mechanical calculations. And these are very important today because actually doing a calculation nowadays, because our techniques are so good and our computers are so fast, doing these calculations is faster and cheaper than the experiments, and they can also give us information that the experiments cannot. So we do something called first principles calculations or ab initio calculations. They use a technique called density functional theory. I'm not going to tell you much about it, except to say these are called first principles calculations because the only input to the calculation is atomic numbers and atomic masses. Everything else is just calculated using pure quantum mechanics. And the person who developed this technique, his name is Walter Kohn, and he was given the Nobel Prize for this technique in 1998. Okay, so how do we do it? We take some catalysts, say catalyst A, catalyst B, catalyst C on the computer, we do computations, then we analyze our results. By analyzing these results, we get insight into why catalysts behave the way they do. And then using this, we hope we can design an even better catalyst. Okay, so we have design principles for catalysts. This is a picture of Professor Jens Nørskov. He is, I would say, easily the dominant figure in this field. Many of the ideas we have, we owe to him, and he's, I would say, quite easily the leader in this field. Now, from him, we have many design principles, but I will tell you only about one of them. I will try to explain it to you. I think it's the one that's conceptually easiest. So I'm going to try to explain it to you. So the roots of this idea go back quite a while to someone called Sabatier. And he said that the best catalysts bind the atoms or molecules with intermediate strength. That is, the catalyst should be sticky, but not too sticky. Okay? So he was a French scientist, and he got the Nobel Prize in 1912 because he found catalysts that could hydrogenate organic compounds. Okay? In the presence of finely disintegrated metals, the finely disintegrated metals were the catalysts for these reactions. So what am I saying? I'm saying the catalyst should be sticky. That is, why should it be sticky? Because the molecules that are reacting in this animation, you see the nitrogen molecules and the hydrogen molecules are coming down on the surface, and they should stick. Now, how sticky it is depends on what the catalyst is and what the molecules are that are coming down. So there's not a universal stickiness. It depends from case to case. So it should be sticky, otherwise you won't get any absorption of your reactants on your catalyst. If it is not sticky enough, then you will have something like this. The reactants are coming and they're just bouncing off. So your reaction won't happen. But if it is too sticky, then after your reaction happens, then your products are not going to go away. They're just going to be stuck there. That is called poisoning of the catalyst. That is not good. Okay? So instead, you want it to happen. What's happening in this picture, you see after the ammonia is being formed, it is flying away. So it should not be too sticky. So how can you control this stickiness? You change the elements that the catalyst is made of, and you use this Sabatier principle to optimize. So here, for example, is a graph for the synthesis of ammonia on different transition metal catalysts. On the y-axis is how good a catalyst it is, and on the x-axis is the absorption energy of nitrogen. What that means is that these are more sticky, these are less sticky, and if it is intermediate stickiness, it's the best catalyst. Now, if you're paying attention to my talk, which I hope you are, you would have noticed something, which is, wait a minute, the best catalyst is ruthenium. And I told you that iron is the best catalyst that they use. Why is ruthenium better? Now, ruthenium is actually a better catalyst, but it is too expensive. Okay, ruthenium costs 850 rupees a gram. Iron costs 3 paisa a gram. That's why most plants use iron, though some plants do use ruthenium. Okay, so now you can play with this and try different combinations of elements to see something that is coming at the top of this volcano plot. For example, in the Nørskov group, they found cobalt molybdenum alloy will do well. And in fact, some plants are beginning to use cobalt molybdenum as a catalyst. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to tell you is making a better catalyst. You can change the shape of the catalyst if it's a nano catalyst. This is some work done in my group. We found that if you, instead of making it a clumped up shape like this, you make it flat, then this is the dissociation barrier, the energy you have to supply to dissociate oxygen. It goes, here it's 0.68 eV, here it's 0.29 EV. So you've reduced the height of the barrier you have to climb, so you made it a better catalyst. This work was done by my student Nisha Maman. And if you look carefully here, you will see that the two earrings she's wearing, they are the two shapes of nanoparticle. On this here, it's the flat nanoparticle. On this, it's the clumped up nanoparticle. Okay, another problem with nanoparticles is that they are unstable. to what is called sintering. So this is an electron micrograph of nanoparticles. And you see, if you look over here carefully, look at these two nanoparticles, you see they're moving together. And after some time, they're going to coalesce and they're going to form a bigger nanoparticle. And then when they become bigger like this, they're going to slowly lose their catalytic activity. And you don't want this to happen. So you want to understand how do nanoparticles move, how do they sinter. So this is something that we have studied in our group also. So here I'm showing you, we've studied how a single platinum atom is moving along a magnesium oxide surface. This platinum atom is the catalyst. This is also like a chemical reaction because bonds are made and broken as it moves along the surface. So this movement is what's called hopping, and the energy you have to supply to break the bonds as it moves along, we found is 0.88 eV. If you instead have a nanoparticle consisting of two platinum atoms, you see it moves quite differently, it doesn't hop along, it is cartwheeling. Okay, so watch what it does. It cartwheels as it goes along. If you have three, then it's doing something very different. For those of you who have watched the Star Wars movies, there are these transports called at walkers. So this 3-atom nanoparticle is moving like an at walker. And if it is 4 platinum atoms, then it is rolling along. So this is all very fascinating, and we use all this to study how the nanoparticles move along the surface and how they sinter. Okay, so I'm almost done. I just want to end by telling you about some of the current challenges and the future. So the race is on to find better catalysts for many reactions. Some of the important ones are catalysts for water splitting, carbon dioxide conversion to methanol or ethanol, and catalysts for ammonia synthesis. Let me tell you very quickly about this. So hydrogen is the ultimate clean fuel. That is, if you burn hydrogen, the only exhaust you have is water. Okay, but you want, how do you get this hydrogen? Right now, most people get hydrogen by combusting natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, so that's not good. So you want a catalyst that will split water into hydrogen and oxygen, because water is easily available. So that's something we want a good catalyst for. Another thing is, as you know, I mentioned already, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. So there's atmospheric carbon dioxide is going up and up and up, and the temperature of the world is going up and up and up. So that is bad. So we want to get rid of the carbon dioxide. So can we convert this carbon dioxide into something useful? Okay. So for example, can you convert it to methanol or ethanol, which you can use as fuels? So there's in fact a competition which is offering $20 million to somebody who can do this. It's called the X Prize, and I'm happy to announce that two of my colleagues from JNCASR, Sebastian Peter and Umesh Wagmare, are finalists in this prize. The prize winners will be announced next year. And finally, the Haber-Bosch process, it requires very high temperatures, very high pressures. The hydrogen for it is generated from natural gas. It has large carbon dioxide emissions. It needs gigantic chemical plants. So we would like to find another catalyst that can generate the ammonia at low temperatures, low pressures. So, I mean, these are just 3 of the reactions people are working on, but there are many, many, many challenges like this. And finally, just something fun to mention. There is a company called Catalytic Clothing, which is making clothes. It's sort of a washing powder that has catalytic particles in it. And when you wash your clothes with it, they get embedded with these catalytic particles, which clean air. They remove pollution from air. So when you wear these clothes and move through the air, the idea is that you purify the air. So this is something futuristic that maybe we will all do one day. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. I'm done.
Thank you very, very much, Shobana, for this wonderful talk. So now I would uh, uh, welcome questions.
Yeah, so people can type in their questions in the chat, and please make sure that the questions are relevant to the talk. So we have already received a few questions, Professor Shobna. So I'll start with the first one.
Yeah.
So Mr. AK from YouTube is asking, how does one estimate the amount of substance in the world? Example, osmium available at the time is 80 kg. How is this found for any material? For example, iron.
Okay, this is obviously not an exact calculation, but I think the amount estimated is not the amount of osmium that is there in all earthly sources. They mean how much is available in pure form to industry or chemists. So that is easier to do because you have a list of industries and chemical suppliers, and so you can ask them how much they have available to them. So this is not how much is potentially available, but how much is actually available for practical purposes.
Okay, thank you for the answer, Professor Shobna. So I'll move on to the next question. The next question is a little interesting. It's from Kiran Mehta, and he's asking on YouTube, Ayurveda uses gold in macroscopically fine particulate sizes, referred to as bhasma, with great pharmaceutical effects. Is gold playing catalyst in fighting illnesses?
So gold nanoparticles are used a lot also in what is called nanomedicine. It is not a field that I'm expert on, but as far as I understand it, it is not there playing a catalytic role, but it is used as a carrier for various other medicines. I do not think it is used as a catalyst, but I don't think it plays the role of a catalyst there, but I do not think enough is known about it yet. I think it's still a field of ongoing research, but it is certainly very much an interesting field right now of gold, finely divided gold as a medical agent. It is something that certainly it's true that in India we seem to have used it long before it was thought of in the West. It is also something that we have to think about carefully for its beneficial effects as well as its dangers, because one dangerous thing about nanoparticles in medicine is that you might know there's something called the blood-brain barrier, which is that things above us, things have to be below a certain size to pass through the blood-brain barrier. And nanoparticles could in principle go through this. Now you may want it to, but you may also not want it to. So I think this is something we are still beginning to understand and investigate. So it may also have some dangerous consequences if things go through the blood-brain barrier, which you don't want them to go through. I think that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you for the answer. So I'll move on to the next question now. Manoj is asking, what is the property that makes iron a catalyst? How its catalytic properties can be improved further?
Okay, so as I said, it varies a lot from reaction to reaction. And it's a complicated issue, what makes something a catalyst. It seems to depend a lot also on quantum mechanical properties, like what are the energies of the electrons, how are the energies with respect to what's called the Fermi level, etc. But I think the simplest way of understanding ions effectiveness as a catalyst for the Haber process is this picture, which is looking at the stickiness versus the non-stickiness, and saying that if it is too sticky or not sticky enough, it is not a good enough catalyst. And here you see that iron has somewhat intermediate stickiness. Ruthenium is the best. And actually osmium, which is not in this graph, is the second best. And iron is kind of the third best in terms of having this intermediate stickiness. But what, at a more technical level, what makes something sticky or not sticky is the strength of the binding between the atoms of that element to the molecular adsorbents, which again depends upon the available energy levels and where the electronic levels are placed. But this is the best I can do at a layperson level, I think.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to the next question quickly because there are so many questions coming in. And the next question, Jake is asking, ma'am, why do some catalysts work in some reactions but not in others?
Yeah, so this is, again, I mean, it's a complicated question because there is no, as I said, what makes something a good catalyst is not a very simple answer, but I could again try to explain it in terms of this thing about stickiness, in that here, as I've said, the degree of stickiness depends on the molecule, the chemical species of the catalyst atoms, and how these are arranged. So different molecules, for a different molecule, you may have the optimum stickiness from a different catalyst. So on the particular reaction, you may have to find the catalyst that has the optimal level of stickiness. It is not like the stickiness is universal. If I want to see, I don't know if the person asking me is a scientist or a lay person, so I don't know what kind of language to use in in answering this question. But for example, even when we have glues which are sticky, you have some glues which are best at sticking broken china and broken glass, and other glues which are best for sticking leather. So in the same way, a certain catalyst might have the optimal level of stickiness for the particular molecule species that takes place, that's taking part in that reaction. That is a gross simplification, but that is one way of looking at it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So a related question from Meera Day, the stickiness calculation is model dependent. I think she's asking, is it model dependent, the stickiness calculation?
Okay, so, well, not entirely, because right now, how we look at the stickiness is we calculate the adsorption energies, which we use for, so for example, here in this calculation, you use the nitrogen adsorption energy, and that is calculated using what I mentioned, which is density functional theory, which is not very model dependent. There is one parameter there which is called the exchange correlation functional, and it might be slightly dependent on the exchange correlation functional, but I would say right now we know how to calculate this pretty well. Where the model might come in is you might wonder, how do you decide whether it is how sticky nitrogen is, or how sticky hydrogen is, or how sticky the ammonia molecule is? And there it might vary slightly. For that, you need to know, again, the reaction pathway, what are the different steps in the reaction, and you need to decide what is the most important step in the reaction. So what to put on the x-axis is called the descriptor. And something like ammonia synthesis is rather simple in that it only has a few steps, 5 or 6 steps. But there's certain reactions which have, 300, 400 steps. And then it becomes difficult to decide what to plot it versus. But they are finding that there seem to be some universal scaling relations. And so it doesn't matter too much what you plot. So there is a slight model dependence, but not too much so, because as I said, these first principle calculations, you're not really doing any modeling. You're only putting in atomic numbers and atomic masses, and everything else is a more or less exact machinery.
Thank you, Professor Shobna, for the answer. I think I also had a similar question. So Vishnu Priya HR is asking, Professor Shobna, this was a wonderful talk. I have a question regarding single atom catalysis.
Yeah.
How exactly is single atom catalyst beneficial to, say, 8 atom catalyst, which you mentioned in the talk? How is an optimum number of atoms in a catalyst determined?
Okay, so this is a very good question, and this is something where we really do not have an answer yet. I mean, there is no universal answer. Whether 1 atom is better or 8 atoms is better seems to depend wildly on, it depends on the species of your catalyst. It depends on what is the substrate that you put your catalyst on. It depends on which particular reaction you are looking at. So there's no universal relation. So for example, this graph which I showed you how the catalytic activity varies versus the number of atoms. Notice for this reaction, if you have only 1 atom, there's 0 catalytic activity. There's no catalytic activity at all. So it really varies a lot. And so we are still trying to understand how to do this. And you have to actually do the experiment or do the calculation. And I would say that we still do not have a good understanding of how to generalize to get any general rules on this. We have to look at it system by system. Because this, at these really small scales, I've written there's no smooth dependence on size. So the scaling rules don't seem to work very well. We have some broad scaling rules which work better at larger sizes. At this, I mean, we understand some things like how the energy levels move, matters, etc. But to predict how those energy levels will move, that is something we can't predict until we actually do the calculation. I'm done.
Thank you, Professor Shobna. A quick question, because we have been using the word sticky, stickiness. So yeah. Shania is asking, what makes it sticky on a quantum level?
Yeah, so what makes it sticky on a quantum level is the strength of the bond between the adsorbate and the catalyst. And this seems to depend on various parameters. So there's something called the D-band model of catalysis, for example, which was developed by Noskov, whose picture I showed you, which says that it seems to depend on how deep the D electrons of the transition metal are in energy relative to the Fermi level of the system. That's all I can say in catalytic, in quantum mechanical language.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to the other questions. So we have a very limited time left, and I'll try to take as many questions as possible. So Gautam is asking, have you looked into metal oxides for water splitting and TiO2 gold composites to go from CO to CO2 to methanol. I guess the main question is, have you looked into metal oxides for water splitting?
Yes, in fact, we have, and I actually have some. I mean, I haven't, but people have. So I do have some slides about that as my backup slides, because I mean, I made far more slides than I had time to show, and then I pulled out some of them. So the first good catalyst for water splitting was titanium dioxide, which was found by these two Japanese gentlemen, Honda and Fujishima. And so this is a photocatalyst for this reaction. That is, by just shining sunlight on TiO2, you can split water. And then now a really hot area is looking at perovskites, which are also oxides. And so, for example, this is a computational study where they screened 2,601 perovskites to narrow down which would be the best for water splitting. So certainly this is, and then of course, combining metal nanoparticles with oxides is also a very active field, both for, I mean, for all the reactions I mentioned, I would say. So yes, I haven't done it, but many people do it.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to the next question. So there are several questions regarding the medicinal effect of nanoparticles. I'll just read one because you've already addressed a question similar to that. Could it be possible that homeopathy is based on catalytic effect of nanoparticles caused by creating diluted potencies of various homeopathic medicines? Radhika is asking this question. And there are similar questions where the nanoparticle and its medicinal effect and catalysis is being asked. So I will just ask one such question.
Okay, again, I am not an expert on this field, so I can only go by what I have heard in talks where scientists have talked about homeopathy. So if homeopathy works, then scientists do not at present understand how it works, because the dilutions used in homeopathy are so low that I am told that in a single active dose used in homeopathy, there may be no atom or molecule of the active agent present. And if that is true, then certainly as science, by our current scientific knowledge, we do not believe that it can work. So, but this is totally outside my area of expertise. So my understanding is that at present, current science cannot explain, does not have an explanation for homeopathy.
Okay, I'll quickly move on to the next question, Professor Shobna. So this is related to experiment. Physics for Passion Souls is asking, is it possible to substitute exactly N atoms on the substrate experimentally?
Yes, it is. They use what's called a mass spectrometer, which can measure exactly the mass of a nanoparticle and separate it out very precisely according to the number of atoms in the nanoparticle. But I should say that currently those techniques can be done in a lab. They cannot be done in an industrial scale. So you have to think how to do it in an industrial scale. There are other ways of doing it, which are chemical techniques. But there, the nanoparticles have these chemical ligands attached to them, and those, for the most part, in most cases, they seem to destroy the catalytic activity. But there are other things that people are also looking at, which I didn't have time to talk about. So, for example, here is something which we are also looking at right now, which is this is a case where you don't have just one metal atom, but the one metal atom is at the center of an organic molecule. So this is what's called cobalt phthalocyanine. And then that seems to be a good catalyst for converting carbon dioxide to methanol. And then you disperse it on graphene or on a carbon nanotube. So this is something that could conceivably be scaled up at an industrial level. And so you could think of using these kinds of systems. And this is something that my student Saurabh, for example, has been looking at, how to tune cobalt phthalocyanine by putting it on one nitrogen atom or two nitrogen atoms and changing the oxidation state. We had a paper just very recently in Nanoletters. We didn't look directly at the catalytic activity, but we looked at the oxidation state. So these are other routes to pursue. Yeah.
Wonderful. So we are almost approaching the end of our time limit. So I'll just take two last questions. So Navonil Karmakar is asking, D block elements are very widely used as catalysts. Why is that?
So it seems to be because so this is again because of this, I don't know how to give it, I don't have a simple way of doing it, of answering it, except for saying that there is this whole D-band theory of catalysis, which seems to say that if you have partially filled D-bands in the electronic structure and you can tune the energy levels of these D-band states, that seems to control how adsorbate molecules bind to the metal. I'm sorry, I don't have a simpler way of answering that. I don't know what to say better than that.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next question then. And Rohit is asking, photolysis of water yields hydrogen and oxygen.
Yeah.
Chlorophyll molecules aid in this process. What are your thoughts in utilizing or synthesizing a substance like chlorophyll to gain hydrogen as a fuel?
Yeah, so I mean, this is again a very big area of research, which is people want to carry out what is called artificial photosynthesis. I think people have not been very successful so far because the kinds of, if they try to make molecules that are similar to the biological molecules that carry out this process, then they degrade in the lab or whatever. I mean, they seem to be stable in biological systems, but they degrade outside biological systems. But certainly people are trying to get inspiration from photosynthesis in order to carry out artificial photosynthesis. I should also say that, notice that in the actual photosynthesis, it produces oxygen, but not hydrogen. And what we are more interested in currently is producing hydrogen, but certainly you can adapt the ideas to focus on producing hydrogen as your main goal. I mean, that's a whole field which I haven't talked about. And photosynthesis is a very complex process with many, many, many steps. And it's an active area of research.
Okay, thank you.
But certainly I didn't mention this, but I should say that the real interest in water splitting is in using solar light to split water. So to find a catalyst where you can have what's called a solar fuel, so that it is light that shines on the water and catalyst system and then splits it. So in that sense, it is similar to photosynthesis.
Thank you, Professor. This would be the one. This would be the last question I'll take because the time is exceeding. Pooja Sharma is asking, can Sabatier principle be applicable or effective to nanocrystal catalysts such as copper oxide in liquid phase? Is the question clear?
To copper oxide
In the liquid phase, example, copper oxide nanoparticles catalyzing solid formation in hydrocarbon fuel.
Okay, so
do you want me to read the question again?
Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly what she means, but I think it is a general principle that one can use. It depends perhaps a little bit on the size of the nanoparticles, but how it is generally used is more for slightly larger nanoparticles, and you look at the strength of binding, say on step edges or something like that. You don't use the Sabatier principle, for example, to understand why the size dependence on 1 atom, 2 atom, 3 atom, etc. That is not really a place where the Sabatier principle works very well.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Shobna, for the wonderful talk and very nice animations. We really enjoyed it. And we have addressed almost all the questions that we have received. So I'll hand over to Rukmini if she has anything to add. And if any of our panelists, Professor Gopakumar, Vijay, has any questions to ask the speaker.
So I'll wait a minute for questions. Other questions? So if there are no more questions, I would like to thank Shovana for this wonderful talk and for the great animation and the quality of the slides. Thank you so much.
Okay, I should say that the animations are not mine for the most part, except for a few of them. Most of them I got off the web. Anyway.
Yeah, but still a lot of effort to put them in. And yeah, thank you so much. We really enjoyed your talk and hope to see you again.
Okay, bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking me.
Thank you, Professor Shobna. Very nice.